So the border is a bit like an iceberg. Lots of people think they know everything about the border because they got on a plane once and had to show their passport to somebody. But there's a huge amount going on that people don't see, that I would know about, obviously, and others working in the Home Office. Now, of course, policy in government is that you can't talk about this stuff. If you are working in the Home Office or you're working in the Border Force or the police, really, you can't come and have this sort of chat with you. The government will release the information it wants to release. The journalists will scrutinise that and want to dig beneath it and find out, for one reason or another, well, actually, is that real or is that true? So I do detect a huge amount of political spin in the area of immigration. I think so that's really quite important that you get back to facts.
Right. Afternoon, Tony.
Good afternoon.
How you doing?
All right, thank you.
Thanks for coming in.
Welcome.
You wrote a book that's it's a big conversation at the moment right now.
Yeah, been a conversation for a while.
Well, but more recently, it's becoming we'll talk about the topic of immigration. It's becoming one of the key policy items for a lot of political parties, certainly populist parties, and something under challenge. So, just for our readers, if do you want to give the background to Changing Borders, why you wrote it?
Yeah, okay. Well, so I actually joined something called the Immigration Service in 1975 as a young immigration officer straight out of school. So I found myself on a desk at Heathrow checking people's passports, deciding who could come in and who couldn't, really. That's where it all began. And, you know, if someone turned up with a dodgy passport or didn't have a passport or the right papers, then I'd refuse them entry and send them straight back on the plane that they arrived on. And then I moved into London immigration enforcement, where we started to find more and more people who were already in the country that shouldn't be. So I started getting involved with, removing people who were here unlawfully. Same kind of process, really, serving notices to airlines to remove them. So I kind of drifted into this business and stayed with it and climbed up the slippery pole of the Immigration Service and the UK Border Agency and the UK Border Force to the top of the tree over a period of 41 years. And, whenever I sort of went out to dinner with friends or had a drink with friends, they say, Tony, you really ought to write a book because you've got such huge stories and so much experience of border management over all these years. So it took me 7 or 8 years to write that book. I was only doing it in bits and pieces. I was on holiday with a wife and she's reading a book and I'm writing a bit more of mine. And I ended up doing a third section about all the things that I've done since I retired in 2013 for the last 10 years, doing media and writing stuff about, like you say, the current situation with asylum, irregular migration, foreign criminals, deportation, anti-smuggling. All of this was things that I dealt with during my time in the government and are still, as you say, very highly topical. So I still find myself quite often being asked for views and opinions on what's going on.
But you focused a lot on US immigration.
I did, because I spent 3 years in Canada. Okay. Between 2000 and 2003, I was on a sort of an exchange program between the Home Office and Immigration Canada. And it just, they appointed me as a fairly senior position. I was Director of Ports of Entry in Canada, and I was a grade 7 at that time in charge of Heathrow. But while I was there, 9/11 happened, which was an absolute watershed for anybody who's been working in immigration or borders, because then border security became a big issue, which wasn't really in Canada at the time. They were more a country of immigration. They were scouring the world, trying to find people to bring in, to live in the provinces and so on. But then suddenly border security, well, it hit the States. And I mean, if America sneezes, then Canada catches a cold. So I found myself very quickly involved in border security and how do you identify criminals and terrorists that might be pervading your country? How do you do border security? Then brought that back with me. And then when I was appointed Director of Ports of Entry in the UK, 7/7 happened, which was the birth of homegrown terrorism, where, our own people were actually travelling abroad for training and coming back into how do we find them? How do we spot them? How do we stop that? And then so inevitably I got the international experience as well as the UK experience on border security. So they put me in charge of border security for the London 2012 Olympic Games, which actually, that worked. That works. And I suppose on the basis lightning couldn't really strike 3 times in one place, could it? And it didn't. So I've got quite a lot to tell about securing borders, not just immigration, but also against, terrorism and and organised crime threats.
So what are the biggest challenges when working on immigration, when you're actually part of the border force? What are the biggest challenges you face? Because there seems to be different areas of debate with immigration. One is what is useful economic immigration and what is not useful, and what is the impact of high migration, but also trying to prevent criminals and terrorists coming to the country. There's so many different areas.
Yeah, so that does make it, that in itself makes it difficult. I mean, I was head of the border force, and you would think that because I was head of the border force, I controlled things like that. I would decide things like immigration and security, but it wasn't really that. I mean, there are about 26 different departments and agencies in this country that have an interest in what's crossing the border, like HMRC Customs for revenue protection, National Crime Agency for organised crime, even things like health, when we had COVID, and agriculture to make sure that we're not bringing in, importing, goods that might harm them. So it's a tapestry of different departments and different agencies. And you can't do anything, with we had about 9,000 people scattered across about 150 ports of entry, which are manned. Many hundreds more ports that aren't manned, and small harbours dealing with the threats to the country. What are we really worried about? What are the most important things? And that is driven by ministers, really. At the end of the day, it's the government of the day that controls the border. And so it's concerns that the government has or doesn't have, or policies the government wants or wants not to, that we have to implement, not just in the border force, but in immigration enforcement, in the customer service group, in the visa department, in the National Crime Agency. So there's so it's really quite difficult. Well, what is it that you want us to focus on? What are the top 5 priority areas for the government that you really want us to deal with? And trying to get consensus across departments about, what are the priorities? I mean, one of the big priorities for me, coming up to the Olympics, you think it'd be border security. One of the big worries was queues. They really didn't want TV cameras outside Heathrow filming people coming out complaining that they'd been stuck in passport control for 3 hours. So that was a top priority. That we've got lots of important people coming into the country. Tony, I don't really want to hear any stories about it wasn't easy for them to get in. So then you have to find a different way of clearing people. You have to see, what checks can we do before they arrive? Can we get them to register their fingerprints before they come rather than doing it at the airport when they land? And can I get resources? Can I get, reserve resources on peak days into Heathrow so every desk is manned? That became a really, really big priority at that time for the border force. But of course, woe betide you if you let somebody through the border that did something dreadful during the Olympics. You would have been expected to stop that too. So I suppose the big challenge really is, how do you sort out the needles in the haystack of people and goods that are coming into the country? How do you find those harmful needles, if you like, people and goods that are really dangerous and really harmful? That's not just a challenge just in this country. I mean, that's a challenge worldwide.
And how do you?
So increasingly it's to do with data. When I was an officer, we didn't have any computers, let alone data. I just had a black book of names and looked you up. And if you weren't in that, and your passport was okay, you'd probably get in. But now we get all of the passenger data from the airlines before your flight lands. That's all sent to a targeting centre in Manchester where it's filtered out. So we've already done a lot of checks. We just moved in this country to something called digital permissions, or we are moving to digital permissions, which means everybody other than British and Irish citizens will need a digital permission before they can even get on a plane. A bit like with America.
Like the ESTA?
Yeah. We're bringing in our version of that. And so are the EU. So more and more we're doing it. It's called pushing the border out. So what checks can you do before that person or before that ship leaves its point of departure? And can you stop bad people and bad stuff getting on it in the first place? That's the most effective way of controlling borders these days, rather than wait until it arrives on your doorstep and then you've got a hassle of having to detain people, detain goods, delays, all that kind of thing. So There's a big industry out there now about data analytics, intelligence-led targeting, where we try to do this as best we can, and say, well, actually, on that flight, there are 2 or 3 people that probably do need to be stopped. So let's make sure, the gate doesn't open when they approach the gate, or they don't get through the border, and that they're sent into secondary, where officers can have a good old look in their bags and a good old dig around in their background before we decide what to do with them. It's a kind of a filtration process, I suppose.
Like, how many? So are there quite a few people there for once we have our version of an ESTA that would be blocked from even boarding that plane? That just makes your job easier, I guess.
Yeah, but you've got to decide whether to give them an ESTA or not in the first place.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So is you talk about moving the border outwards? Are we quite behind other countries then by having not done that?
Yeah, we are way behind some countries. It started in Australia for the Sydney Olympics in 2000. The Americans did it. Canadians have done it. The EU are about to do it, so we're about level with them. I mean, we're pretty well neck and neck with them. But a lot of other countries don't have this at all. A lot of countries don't even have advanced passenger information systems. So I spend quite a lot of time running around the world. Very nice, chairing different conferences where we get border agencies from all over the world coming in, and, we spot the difference really between some of the countries that are new and emerging with technology just being rolled out there, and some of the more advanced countries that, are wrestling with this problem of integrated border management and so many different fingers in the pie that you're not quite sure, which one's actually baking it.
I guess one of the areas I really want to get into with you is that I want to get into the political bit, in that it has become a political hot potato.
Yeah.
It's a big discussion at the moment. People were very critical of immigration rising under Tony Blair, how it accelerated under the Conservatives. Big discussions about Rwanda and how you deal with people coming in. Reform have made it a big part of their policy, but also it became a big part of the policy in the US. We saw that as Trump's campaigning on border security on the southern borders. But also, we are. The US is a country that was built on immigration, and so when you see these discussions, and having worked on border security and immigration, can you yourself see through what is political spin and what is real?
Yes, I think so.
So, what could you tell the vote, like a vote in public? What is the real issues here?
So the border is a bit like an iceberg. Lots of people think they know everything about the border because they got on a plane once and had to show their passport to somebody. But there's a huge amount going on that people don't see, that I would know about, obviously, and others working in the Home Office now. Of course, policy and government is that you can't talk about this stuff. If you are working in the Home Office, or you're working in the Border Force, or the police, really, you can't come and have this sort of chat with you. You can't write stuff for the papers. You are actually bound to don't talk to the media. Everything goes through comms branch. It goes through, special advisors. So there's only a certain, so that the government will release the information it wants to release. The journalists will scrutinise that and want to dig beneath it and find out, for one reason or another, well, actually, is that real or is that true? So I do detect a huge amount of political spin in the area of immigration. I think so. That's really quite important that you get back to facts, because really, you can spin facts, but facts are facts. And I think you also need to look at what's going on around the world as well and see how public opinion is shifting as a result of the facts that are emerging. So, for example, you mentioned the US southern border. I've been down there 2 or 3 times in the last couple of years. I know them quite well. But if you were with a Border Patrol agent now, he will say to you, really, he's been there 30 years. He's never seen anything like it. It is unprecedented, the volumes of people crossing the US southern border at the moment, not just Mexicans or even South Americans. They're getting people from Asia, people from China, flying into visa-free South American countries, going up through very dangerous routes through the Darien Gap to get to the US border where they can lodge a claim for asylum. Now, the Trump administration struggled with this. The Biden administration has struggled with this. The new Trump administration will struggle with this, because the dilemma you have is that when somebody actually presents at your border and claims asylum, you can't then immediately send them back. If you do that, you are breaching international law. So what countries do, we mentioned pushing the border out. you're pushing the border out to try and stop people from getting to your country in the first place if they're not entitled to come. Now, you can do that quite easily on air routes, because if you've ever been abroad, I'm sure when you've checked in to come back, you've had to show your passport with your boarding pass to get on the plane. Had you not been able to do that, then the airline wouldn't let you on a plane. Simple as that.
Yeah, well, like you say, the board coming out, I travel to the US regularly. One time I forgot to update, re-register my ESTA. It was out of date. The 2 years had passed. I went to check in. They wouldn't let me on the plane. And I had to do a new ESTA registration. I missed that flight and had to get a later flight.
Yeah, so that was probably just an innocent mistake on your part.
Yeah, of course, totally, yeah.
But others will try to defeat the ESTA system, either through impersonating someone or by presenting false information when they apply for it. So now they've got you. The Americans have got you on their records. If you've ever been to the States or ever applied to go to the States, there's a huge library of data, which they will know all about you, when you entered, when you exited, what. And when they decide to whether or not to give you a new ESTA, they will look you up and see, well, how have you been behaving? And if your behaviour's been good and your record's good, then you'll get another ESTA to go. But if it's been bad, then you won't get an ESTA at all. You'll be told, no, you can't come to America. You'll have to, and if you really want to persevere with your application, you have to go and see someone in the US Embassy in London and explain why it was that you were doing that thing at that time that they know about. So there's all this sort of, advanced passenger analytics going on in places like the States and here and in the EU and a lot of the more advanced countries, where we're checking your credentials to travel before you come. So when we fast forward to this digital permission system that we're bringing in here, we've already started rolling it out actually for some countries in the Gulf, and it's going to be extended next year to everybody who's not British or Irish. You're going to have to. The same thing might happen to them as happened to you when they come up to the desk to try and get some flights to the UK. They might be saying, "Well, actually, you haven't got your necessary clearances. You can't get on this flight." Now, what the Home Office have said is, well, we're going to be careful. We're not going to have a big bang approach and suddenly, everybody gets stuck in different parts of the world because this data's arrived. We're going to not enforce it rigorously to start off with, but they will be gradually improving their communications to make it clearer and clearer that as time goes by, this won't be tolerated. Unless you've got a digital permission to come to the country, you won't be able to get on board a vessel or an aircraft to come here in the first place.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
Is it possible that some people would be coming on what appears to be a holiday and just not leave?
Oh, yes, that's always been the case.
So would that fall under your remit previously?
Well, the Home Office has reorganised itself a great many times over the years I was there. I mean, let's say I joined the Immigration Service, and an immigration officer, which I was, could work either at Heathrow, or I could go down to London docks to check the shipping, or I could go to Dover to check the ferries, or if I was working on in-country work, I could go down into London with the police to check people's documents. It was all the same thing, really. It's been cut up now quite a lot, with different departments and different agencies. So we've now got something called, it's the Customer Services Group. It's called CSG now, but it was UK Visas and Immigration. They're the ones that decide whether you get a visa to come here or not. And quite a lot of people don't get a visa. They try, but they can't get a visa because they don't qualify for visas. So, they deal with that bit. So there's the visas bit of it. Then at the border, you've got the border force. They're the single uniform now. I mean, we merged with customs in 2008. So, we do people and goods. So, you could find yourself on the desk one day and then you're down in the red-green channels the next day. You might be out in a freight checks the day after that. So the complexion of the border force has changed quite a bit. Then in country, you've got immigration enforcement, whose job it is to go and find illegal immigrants basically and remove them from the country. But they also have to work with the police, with the licensing, the local authorities. And then you've got this huge asylum infrastructure that sort of pervades everything, because once asylum comes into play, and it always does, invariably comes into play if you have entered by irregular means, then you will be advised, well, if you don't want to get sent straight back, then the best way to not to get sent straight back once you came is to claim asylum.
It sounds like that's a system that is open to abuse.
Yes, it is open to abuse.
And easy to it.
So I think the facts that people need to understand, perhaps they wouldn't understand, is that for years we've had a policy of preventing asylum seekers from getting to this country in the first place. That's been going on for 30 years through the carrier's liability legislation. We've got the juxtaposed controls in Dover. So you can't claim asylum if you're not here. You have to get here. That's the rule. And that's why the boats have become such a big phenomenon, because actually we can't control what happens on the French beaches. We can control what happens at points of disembarkation, because the carriers, the ferry companies will have responsibilities to check documents and check people and so on. But when you're talking about a land border, which we don't, let's not get into Ireland. I mean, we keep Park Island for now, because that's even more complicated. But I mean, essentially we are an island, and so therefore you have to come by ship or you can come through the tunnel now or ferry. But the object is to check people's documents before you board the train or the ferry or the aircraft, and that means basically so the asylum lobby, there's a big lobby saying, well, we should do more, to help people around the world. Will say, well, there's no safe and legal routes to get here. So if you are, if you're genuinely trying to flee from the Taliban and, you want to come to the UK, well, how are you going to get here? Because you won't have a passport. You certainly won't have a visa. You're probably going to go to the next nearest safe country like Pakistan and then try and get here from there. But there isn't an asylum visa as such. You can't apply for asylum. I mean, the way that's always worked in the past is through the UNHCR. So they've got a resettlement program. So you would go to the first refugee camp in the first place at a safe country you can reach, and you would go there. And countries like us and Australia and America and Canada would pick the most vulnerable people from those camps and bring them in under managed integration programs, resettlement programs. Because what's happened, if you look at the figures, the numbers of countries that are putting their hand up to dip into that pool has dropped significantly, because they're faced with this overwhelming number of people that are coming in via irregular routes. So ideally what you want is a world where there is a way that people who are genuinely displaced, either internally or in the adjacent countries, can, demonstrate to UNHCR. And UNHCR are saying, right, okay, there are countries that will take you, and this is how we'll manage it, and we would work with them and bring those most vulnerable people in. But those that are clearly not genuine refugees, that would be sorted out, before you even got near a resettlement program. But that's not how it's working out. So that's why politically people are feeling, I think, that we've lost control. This control, we can't control. This is clearly mischief. People are getting into small boats, and we can see them on the telly. And what are we doing? Well, why don't we send them back? I mean, they're just getting into our territorial, and their ambition is to get into British territorial waters, which is 12 miles from coast.
And once they're in that,
that rule I explained to you applies. They are now subject to UK law, and they can claim asylum from the UK, even though they've literally just crossed the threshold from France. They are now eligible to claim for asylum. Now, once somebody claims asylum, then the border force cannot send them back. They have to be brought ashore, made safe and well, and put into a system or a process where their asylum application is processed. That can take quite a lot of time, because now you don't know who they are. They've thrown their passports away, invariably. quite often to conceal their nationality, their identity, their age, their travel history. They may be telling you an honest story that I really was in this terrible situation in Aleppo where I was being bombed by, people, and I've really got to come and live here because of whatever. But there are others who will not necessarily be telling you that. They will have been told to tell you that by their smugglers who have got a vested interest in getting you into the UK. So the challenge for the Border Force is when somebody, like for irregular migration, places like Manston, when someone approaches your desk with wet feet and just literally all you've got to go on is what they tell you. You don't know who they are. You can take their fingerprints and photograph them, but that assumes that there will be some kind of a biometric record of them, which often there isn't.
Yeah.
You haven't got the capacity to check them with other countries because other countries have got the same problem, so they won't necessarily tell you if they know this person or not. And then you go into this process, which is it's a classic judicial process that we have in this country, an adversarial process between the Home Office and the refugee lawyers, which can go on for weeks, months, years. It clogs up the courts, it clogs up the Home Office system, you develop backlogs, and then governments come and go with different ideas. So I think, the main message is, we need to make a very clear distinction between what we're talking about with legal migration, that is legal routes where you get visas to come here. That's where, the numbers have gone, as you say. They went up under Blair. They went up under Boris Johnson. They've been going up and up to a point where you can control that. You can just stop issuing visas. And then they won't be able to come. They will have to resort to irregular means. The irregular routes are much harder to control, actually, because that relies a lot upon you being able to stop people getting here in the first place. And once they are here, to be able to process them really, really quickly and critically to be able to send them back somewhere.
Yeah, so it sounds to me like when this is brought up as a political talking point, people are perhaps simplifying something they haven't actually been responsible for. And only in power will you find how complicated, difficult this challenge is.
Yeah, it is a complex area of policy. It's very, very complicated. So unless you've studied it, unless you've actually looked around the world, and actually, it's quite easy for a politician to say, "Look what a mess that is. Look at it. These migrants coming off, waving their arms around and disappearing at the community." But that's a very superficial view. Because actually, what is it you're trying to do here? You want to try and control irregular migration. Well, how are you going to actually do that? Now, there are two ways of doing that, and that is the interdiction point that says stop them getting here in the first place, which we do quite well at, actually. Quite a lot of people don't get on planes or boats or ferries to get here in the first place because they get stopped. So you don't get to read about those. But, when they do get here, what are you going to do about that? How are you going to discourage them from wanting to come here in the first place, or from using the system to stay almost indefinitely to the point where the government just simply gives up and says, well, this person's been here for so long now, let's just let them stay. And that's really the hook upon which the smugglers hang their bag of money.
But what can be done? You must have a perspective of what can be done.
Well, so I did support the Rwanda Plan.
Okay.
Actually, I did do some work with the Policy Exchange on a prior plan to that one, but the principle is the Australian sovereign borders model, which I do know some of the people that worked on that. I spoke to them, and the Australians took the approach that it doesn't follow that if you make it into our territorial waters that you're going to get asylum, you're going to get admitted into the asylum system. In fact, better still, in Australia, given it's so far from anywhere, we will interdict you on the high seas. So the Australians would invest in their own coastal cutters, and they would identify vessels come in from places like Indonesia on the high seas. They would board those vessels, seize those vessels, interview the people before they got to Australia, and then they could either return them directly to Indonesia or divert them to places like Nauru or Christmas Island. But the fundamental pretext of that policy is we will not entertain asylum applications from people who come here, by irregular means. That was what the Australians did. The Rwanda model was quite different, but I think it was a very bold attempt by this government. They constructed an interpretation of the 1951 Convention in the Illegal Migration Act, which said that, well, the convention says that you must be, fleeing persecution. You must be fleeing persecution. And, although you don't have to have come from the country you're fleeing persecution from, you're not in immediate fear, actually. You're not immediately in fear of persecution because you've been in France or Germany or somewhere else, and you could quite easily. So anybody who comes here and is not coming directly from the country they're fleeing persecution from will not be admitted into our asylum system at all. Well, what are you going to do with them then? Well, we're going to find somewhere that they can go, and whether or not they have a genuine claim for asylum, they can go there, they can make their asylum claim there, and if granted, they can stay in that country. But we are not going to continue to allow people forevermore to come by irregular means into our British territorials and assume that because they haven't got documents, because they're going to claim asylum, because it's really difficult to remove to some of these countries, that they're going to ultimately, sooner or later, the government will have to back down and let them in, because it's very unusual until quite recently for any of the small boat arrivals to have been sent back anywhere. So the last government bet their boots on Rwanda and of course didn't come off because there were constant legal challenges through the courts, through the British courts, through the European courts on the legality of that construct I just described to you there. They will actually, no, we don't think that, well, either Rwanda's not really safe, is it? So there won't be danger that they might send them back to a place they're going to, refoulement, they might send them back, or alternatively, that actually your construct is wrong. You have there is no way out of this. International law is what it is. It's based on a 51 principle that as soon as someone arrives in your country, you have to let them into your asylum. So those lawyers and judges and lots and lots of time and effort. Meanwhile, the board back in the ranch at the border force and immigration enforcement, there's nothing much you can do about that. I mean, because that is not, you can't put the Home Secretary in contempt of court. You have to await the due process of the law. And then, as soon as you get to a point where you say, well, there's a judgment coming out next week, and it might well go in our favour if it does, you have to then be ready to get a flight ready and people ready on it, ready to go to Rwanda, which we did 2 or 3 times.
Why was Rwanda picked?
I think it's because it's actually called a migration pact. It wasn't just simply a returns agreement. We've been supporting Rwanda for a long, long time, ever since the genocide, 30 years now. We've had a very, very good relationship with helping them rebuild their country. So we've got a very, very good relationship with the government there. There's quite a lot of help that we've been giving them on other things. And actually, we had a hand in giving them the democracy they have now. So we have got, I think, quite a good argument to say, well, it is safe there, actually. And they were interested in as a branch of aid, as a branch of support, in return for the money we send them. How can we help you? Well, one way you could help us is, what would you be happy to resettle some of the irregular migrants that are coming in from France? And they said, well, yes, because we want people here. The only caveat they were concerned, they don't want nasty people. So if they were criminals or terrorists, they don't want any nasty people. So we said, well, all right, well, we'll exclude them. I mean, if they're, then we won't send them. But for generally speaking, if we can identify someone that's clearly come here, by irregular means, has got no antecedents in the UK, no basis to stay in the UK, will you take them? And can you settle them? We will help you. We'll provide we'll help you build accommodation. In fact, we built an entire asylum system in Rwanda, during the last few years to enable people, and they already do have a very significant number of refugees. The UNHCR already use Rwanda as staging posts for refugees, moving them out of Libya and places like that, at least as a staging post until they can be resettled elsewhere. So I think there were a lot of arguments that Rwanda was safe, but I mean, if you go through, and I did sit through many, many hours of debate in the House of Lords about this, I mean, there's very wide political views about whether or not this is some people vehemently opposed to even the concept that you could possibly ever think about sending somebody to a place like Rwanda. You are the British, you've got a responsibility. This is the British government here, and we need to look after. And other people saying, well, this is a perfectly reasonable proposition because we are satisfied that no one would be harmed, and that we think it's a reasonable but the political debate went on for ages and ages, to the point where, in the end, the last government, although they tried it 2 or 3 times, basically said, well, let's go to the country then. But they went to the country before they'd actually been able to demonstrate whether or not Rwanda would have been a deterrent. So we don't know. We'll never know, I don't suppose, whether or not Rwanda would have been a deterrent. But I still think it was a very bold attempt to break the smuggler's business model, because you need to think what's in the mind of the smuggler. And what's in the mind of the smuggler, look, give me €5,000, get in this boat and you'll get to stay in the UK, basically. And largely speaking, that could well be true. I mean, it's pretty well has been the case. Now, this government's come in, and to be fair to them, they have started removing some of these cases, because they've said, no, we're going to forget that idea of not admitting them in the asylum. We will admit them to the asylum system. But some nationalities, actually, we can disprove your asylum claim and we can return you to some countries. So places like Turkey, Vietnam, the last government did it with Albania. These are places where I think you can persuade courts that actually they're not genuinely in fear of persecution. They want to come and live here, obviously for economic reasons, but there's no real fear of state persecution in those countries. And so they have started to remove some of them. But the difficulty is with countries like Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, even if they are, ultimately most of those will qualify for asylum, but even if they're refused asylum, it's very, very difficult to return anybody to those countries. So those nationalities will see that. The communications go back saying, well, look, if you can get in a boat and get into British territorial, you're still going to get to stay. So the political argument at the moment is about the deterrent. Actually, what the Conservatives are saying is, well, look, we had a deterrent, and then Labour's saying, well, yeah, but your deterrent never worked, did it? And so at least we're starting to do something. But I still think we need a deterrent, personally. I think without a deterrent, you haven't been able to persuade some nationalities, it's not worth it. Until you can do that, you're not going to stop the boats.
It's a huge economic burden for the country, because whether it's processing asylum here, you have to put people in accommodation, you have to feed them, you have to run the costs of actually running the judicial process for them to have their asylum heard. And if you're deporting, is the term deporting to Rwanda? Would we use that?
Well, we would say removal probably
yeah.
to Rwanda, or even resettlement perhaps, but deportation is quite a strong word. But same thing.
But there's a lot of cost to that. You've got to schedule the flights. I don't know if these are chartered flights. You have the economic cost of supporting Rwanda itself. So either way, this is a huge economic burden to the country.
Yeah. So like economics and immigration is a really interesting debate, and you will hear from economists. You might interview some economists who will tell you one way or the other the economic benefits or disbenefits of immigration. I mean, in stark terms, the UK replacement rate last time I saw was about 1.5 per capita. So we do need immigration probably if we want to keep population at least level.
Right.
And you probably do need people to come with specific skills to support your ageing population. So there are lots of arguments about, well, actually immigration isn't such a bad thing, really. But what type of immigration are you getting, and what type of person? And I think where the arguments have shifted quite significantly in the last couple of years is the economic disbenefits are shining through. Mm-hmm. And I think even the Migration Advisory Committee is beginning to come round to the idea that actually we shouldn't just be looking at GDP as a measure of economic success. GDP, of course, more people will produce more output, but it's GDP per capita.
Yes.
And the GDP per capita figure has been falling, and that's because quite a lot of the recent migration has been low-skilled migrants bringing in dependents who are indeed a drain on social services, a drain on education, a drain on housing. When people in the indigenous communities are feeling this now and saying, well, wait a minute, we haven't got access to services ourselves, that will fuel a political debate about, well, why are we letting all these people in now? So I come back to the argument that actually there's controlled and non-controlled immigration. So if you wanted to criticise the last government, you could say, well, actually, you were the ones that issued all those visas. You decided to issue loads of student visas and loads of dependent visas and loads of care worker visas. That was a conscious decision by the last government to do that, but there are still economic disbenefits to that. Before you're getting into the irregular migration and, the Rwanda Plan, which, if it had acted as a deterrent and had stopped that boats, would have had economic benefits because less people would have come across. So there's a huge tome of stuff being written about the economic benefits or disbenefits. I think the answer is you've got to be selective, and you've got to make sure that the people you do need to bring people in, but you bring the right people in. Obviously, you've got obligations under international law. So if they're really vulnerable people, then you need to assess, well, what can you take? You can't take everybody, but what can you take from that field? But you have to be firm on the other side of things. So, well, actually, we can't take everybody here. We're going to have very strict numbers, caps on the numbers of people that are brought in here. We'll have very clear skills criteria. If you don't meet those skills, you don't get to come here and you don't get to stay. That's really, I think, what most governments are trying to do, but it's quite hard.
Well, it's really unpopular with some people. Some people just feel like we should have broad immigration. We should allow more people to come here. I think it's that lack of willing to have a hard touch.
Yeah, and I think, even like I listen to some of the backbench Labour MPs are quite fiercely advocating open borders, and, that we should be, as a caring nation, more welcoming to people that are suffering hardship, and we should bring them into our communities. And I know I've been around, I was on the Refugee Commission, we did go around some really lovely people in churches and charities around the country, really looking at me as if I was sort of a bit of an ogre, really, for having the audacity to have ever deported anybody, because that's not the way we should be behaving, really. We should be, but yeah, so that's one wing.
Yeah.
On the other wing, you've got people saying, well, wait a minute, I want some of these services, and why are we spending all this money on them when, we should be spending them on our own people? So the truth is, there's some people that want to put a wall around the country and not let anybody through it. There are other people that don't want any controls whatsoever. That's the reality of it. The answer is always somewhere between the two, right? And the question on your politics is, where do you stand between that extreme and that extreme? The answer for most, middle-thinking people is somewhere in the middle, but it is moving towards the right, and it's moving towards the right, I think, because there's a fear that people are, well, actually, we can't trust the government to control this because we're getting record numbers of immigration, which is having an economic disbenefit to most of us. And also, look at this, these people that are coming up, we don't know who they are, what security is. So that fuels the right-wing argument, not just here, but also in the States and in Europe. You're seeing increasingly people being more hostile to people that are turning up without documents, where you haven't really, you're obliged to take people that you don't really know who they are.
Very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
Yeah, it's look, to me it's kind of obvious, but I know amongst certain quarters saying these things are not popular. Any kind of strong conservative policies is frowned upon, even from within conservative circles these days. But I think there's been such a reaction to certainly the numbers. We had the numbers up recently. I think am I correct, Kurt? It was up until about 93 we had kind of net migration was about zero, like give or take over the years, and we started to get up to 50,000 to, I think by the end of the I think it was about COVID, we were getting up to about 200,000 a year. Then it was getting to near 1 million over the last 4 years. I mean, these are drastic changes in population.
Yeah. So I was in the department then, and this was in the 90s, that the Blair government did really open the door to many, many more people, and net migration did creep up from, as you say, below 100,000 to 200,000, 250, and it was seen by that government at that time, which Blair has since admitted in his book. If you read his book,
no, I haven't.
Well, I've read his book. He said that was a mistake at the time, but actually they felt the economic arguments of immigration outweighed everything else, and so they were prepared. So we did have a huge intake in the Home Office around about that time. And it wasn't till the asylum stuff really started kicking off, and people started getting more and more concerned about numbers. So then Blair was really tough on illegal migration. I mean, he created something which I worked on called tipping the balance, where we were told we need to remove more failed asylum seekers than the new arrivals. So he really focused on removing. But for economic migrants, he had a very open door policy, and that led to the debate about EU, because, of course, then when we had the coalition government and all the Brexit debate started, we said, we can actually stop lots of these people coming, but we can't stop 500 million people from the EU coming here because we've got open agreements under the EU treaties for them. They can come and live here whether they want to or not. So that's what started it, and it was a Bulgaria-Romania accession, if you remember, when they and the government said, "Well, we're not going to give them immediate rights to work because we had done for the A8 countries when Poland and the other countries." So there was some attempt to try and control that, but that's when the Bulgarians and Romanians pushed it up over 300, and we got about 350,000 net, which was causing an outcry. Every time the figures were coming out, it was causing an outcry.
Yeah.
That led to people saying, "Well, in order to control our borders, we have to leave the EU." So we did leave the EU, and eventually we have now got controls on EU migration. But what did they do since then? Well, actually, they've opened global migration to figures 3 times that amount through visa policies that the last government brought into play, which they've now admitted. Yeah. So how many more times are we going to have a government coming in and then saying they made a mistake? I mean, we've had it from Labour and we've had it from the Conservatives. This is an open net for reform.
Yep.
You say, well, how can you trust either of them? I mean, they both told you they were going to control immigration, and neither of them have. So you need to vote for us, and we will. But you will, right? Well, you need some very clear policies about how exactly you're going to do that, because it's not. If it was a golden, if it was a golden nugget to do it, then one of the other parties would have done it by now.
There's also been talk about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights because that also makes it more difficult to enforce your borders.
Yeah. So I do believe in that too, actually. I suppose I'm drifting to the right in this interview, but I'm trying to give you the facts. But I do know, even when I was there, I was putting cases up to ministers of people that had committed some pretty heinous crimes in this country and actually there is a get out of jail clause for the asylum under the 51 Convention. If someone has committed serious criminal offences, it overrides an asylum application, but not human rights. You've still got human rights whether or not you're a murderer or a rapist or anybody else.
I remember quite recently there was a specific one where a fella had abused his daughter. And we wanted to deport him, but we couldn't deport him because of his human rights.
Yeah. So this has been going on for a long time, but it's much more in the public domain now. But I can tell you, it's been going on for a very long time. But Home Office don't comment on individual cases. That's been their policy. But so the main provisions of the Convention on Human Rights are to do with Article 3 and Article 8. Article 3 is I've got a human right to not be degraded or tortured, or it's a basic human right. So you can't send me there, because if they find out who I am and what I've done here, well, then they're going to subject me to inhuman and degrading treatment, which they may well do to some of these countries, right? And the other one is Article 8, a right to family life. So if you have had a relationship in this country or you have a child in this country, these are all human rights lawyers will put all these reasons forward when you come to try and initiate deportation in casework as to why that person cannot. Even if the Home Office persists with that still goes to a judge in the end, and the judge will have to make a judgment call as to whether or not his human rights. And some of these cases you're talking about, that particular case you're talking about, the judge, in his wisdom, decided, well, actually, no, that is a breach. So for so long as you are in the ECHR, and you have to then abide by ECHR judgments. And if you look at some, and I've also read some of these judgments, and some of these judgments are actually do defeat border controls, basically, because they're saying, look, it's almost as if they're saying it's a human right to cross a border. Actually, that's stretching it a bit. So you've got what I would term judicial overreach going on by judgments in the last 10, 20 years, which have been passed down by the European Court. We saw it with the Rwanda blockage, where that was a pajama injunction, where actually this judge didn't know anything about what was going on here. He just got woken up and he's told to issue an injunction to stop the flight. I think that's really frustrated people. So I think that we do need to look at human rights, and what are the human rights of people who have no right to be in this country? Where is the threshold? I mean, there must be some. But I mean, if you're going to dispense with the ECHR, you're going to have to look at the Human Rights Act, which actually enshrined a lot of that into UK law. You're going to have to look at that. And human rights are really tricky because we need them in a lot of scenarios. The Good Friday Agreement, a lot of that was based on human rights. So, I mean, it's going to require some very careful, work, I think, by the government to if we do have a government that wants to get out of that, to put something else in its place. And I do know some much more qualified lawyers than I'd ever be saying to me that, Tony, that will be really, really difficult to do. But you could have something like a UK Bill of Rights. You're now getting into our constitution But, you could have a UK which actually sets out, no, we're sorry, we're no longer abiding by that. This is our human rights, like they've got in the States or Australia, other countries who aren't part of ECHR who've got their own. But it's tricky stuff. But it's big stuff. But it is, I think it is really grating on a lot of people and the political noise that people who come here under a contract, really, you come here, you've made a contract with me that you're going to come into my country and you're going to behave in a certain way, then you misbehave, and yet we still let you stay. I think there's a really big argument. We need to do something about that.
Or let you or can't get rid of you.
Yeah, and then what? And then you just put in more pressure on your prison systems, which we know is already overcrowded. Then you release foreign national prisoners who go on to commit further offences. It's very, very easy to say, let's just lock them all up and deport them all. But, well, you've got to do something about a legislative framework in the first place. You're going to do that. And like you say, then you've still got to find somewhere to send them to. And if you can't get them back to places like Iraq or, Syria or Afghanistan, well, where are you going to send them?
Yeah, that's the thing. These are big, complicated issues. And this is why I'm very careful with this as a subject when I discuss it with people, because I do worry it's one that people are simplifying it, but once they get into power themselves, they would realise how difficult and complicated it is. Yeah,
I think that, and I do quite a lot of media now. I try to stay politically neutral, but it's virtually impossible with the media to stay politically neutral now, because they don't want you to be politically neutral, because the messages are going to turn out to be political one way. It's such a political hot potato, this. It's really hard to have an intelligent, grown-up debate without drifting into politics about what the rights and wrongs of it are. But I mean, I like the idea that MPs are now demanding more information as more data is released from the Home Office.
Rupert Lowe,
but
he's been on this hard.
Well, I know, but I think he's right.
Yep,
I think the government has a duty to disclose information in the public interest. Now, I had to do this when I worked in the Home Office. It's quite difficult sometimes. There is a response you can issue. So, well, sorry, but it's just not possible to give you that data, because we're going to take us years of officer time just to try and dig around all the files to find it. And that's quite often, used as a reason why they can't do it. But actually, the data systems in the department are much, much better now than they were. So I think, it is probably a lot easier if the government are minded to answer some of these questions. So I think what we'll see is a continuing pressure from some of the right-wing MPs to say, look, we need to know exactly how many foreign national prisoners are in this country, how many are in prison, how many. That stuff is probably, I think, retrievable now in the Home Office, but it's going to be the political call of the government ultimately about how much of that stuff they actually release.
Yeah, it's one of those things that feels like it actually needs to be cross-party, because fighting politically over this is detrimental to everybody.
Yeah, I think that's why, some of the Lords, people sort of, decry the House of Lords, have to get rid of it, but they do have some pretty good, experts in committees that could perhaps advise the government. I think the elected government is always going to be whipped into taking a line on something or other. I think it's really interesting with this government that, they haven't actually set out a very clear direction for migration. They've set out their 5 missions, but
they didn't include it.
Didn't include immigration in that, or the milestones. And a lot of journalists say, well, what is your policy then?
Well, Farage brought that up on Question Time as well.
Yeah. And they haven't yet, anyway, set out a strategy. So we've got a UK Border Strategy 2025, which was written in 2020. And we've got a new plan for immigration, which was written in 2021. We've got a new border operating plan model, which was written in 2022. None of these documents have been refreshed. They're all coming up to expiry date, and there is nothing to replace them yet. So there needs to be a plan. I mean, the government needs to set out what its plan will be. I suspect that when they do come up with a plan, it won't be that far different from what the Conservatives were saying. I expect they will want to control numbers, actually. I expect they will want data on economic benefits of migration. They probably will want a more flexible visa policy, even potentially an emergency break on visas. So these are all things that, as you say, probably you could unite the parties on some of this stuff, but when you drift into areas about irregular migration and hotels and deportations and criminals, you're going to have vast disparate views across the political spectrum.
That's mainly down to ideological positions on what our duty is as a country. But it's not an issue that's going away. It keeps coming up. And again, I'm very cautious stepping into it. And like, I think there's things that Reform are talking about that are very interesting as a party. I'm very interested in their points on the economy and driving growth. I think it's very interesting. But the immigration part, I've really struggled with. One, because I think it's very complicated. But two, I think we've also got to a point where we're demonizing certain groups who don't deserve to be demonized. I've been in a refugee camp in Turkey. I've seen what it's like. I've spoken to people there, why they actually are fleeing countries and why. And I feel like we just demonizing an entire group. And so that does become super, super difficult. And I think it's important to hear from someone like you who maybe has got a little bit more experience. Like, if it was down to you, what would you do?
Oh, dear.
Yeah.
What would I do?
And where would you start?
I would start with legal. I mean, irregular migration is only 10% of the number, and that includes lorry drops. So we're talking about 90% of this is now within our control.
Okay.
Since Brexit, we can control who gets a visa. So I would have a root and branch review of the visa policy, and I would get some very clever, politically neutral economists in there to tell me, given the way our country is constructed in a welfare state with a national health service and social housing and all the rest of it, what is the impact of different sectors of visa on that? I want it very well evidenced, right? I don't want any political rhetoric. I want evidence that you can show beyond reasonable doubt that bringing people from that particular cohort, let's say unskilled workers and their dependents of a certain age, into UK communities will, over their lifetime, give us what economic benefit and what economic disbenefit, and share that publicly. I think that you will then find that there is very clear evidence that actually a lot of the unskilled, low-skilled workers, which is a Tories started to, in the death throes of their last administration, to control. I think I'd look very closely at the student sector, because the student sector is not all that it is cracked up to be. There are some very good schools and universities in this college, but there are a lot of people with a vested interest in keeping education establishments open, and it's funded entirely by migrants who, for the most part, are not studying. For the most part, they're delivering, food and working in fast food chains and whatever to afford whatever they can, but they haven't really, and even at the end of all that, the whole idea of the student policy, when I was in charge of UK, I was a regional director in UK border agency, so I spoke to a lot of people in charge of the policy. I wasn't personally in charge of the policy around that. The idea was that you would bring people over from certain countries who would develop real skills at some of our best universities and take them back. And then build infra. And there is some evidence of this happening in places like Africa. At a conference in Africa, there's some fantastic talent that have been to the States or been here and studied and gone back, and now they're running government departments. That's what you really need the student sector to do, but not to prop up, failing educational establishments simply because, they can because of the funding stream. So I'd look at the student policy. I'd look at.
I didn't even know this, by the way. So we're allowing large numbers of student visas just because our university system is failing as a business model?
I think that it's not just the university system though. So you can get an accreditation as a sponsored educational establishment. And then once you've got that accreditation, you can bring the students over. There will be a scrutiny over that. But I think there are vast differences in some of the Russell Group universities and what they offer and what they churn out at the end of the 3 or 4 years compared with some of the other places, which are very much reliant. So you're going to get pushback from the education sector. If you want to toughen up on immigration, the education sector will push you back. The care sector will push you back. Probably the NHS will push you back. The farmers may even push you back in terms of seasonal agricultural workers and so on. Some industry will push you back. So we need low-skilled workers because Brits don't want to do the job. So you've got all those pushbacks coming at you when you're in charge. So you need a very clear evidence base to show that actually, notwithstanding all of those things, this is an economic disbenefit to the country. We must put a cap on these particular visa routes, then work out which visa routes are economically beneficial to the country, again evidence-based, and say these are the sorts of people and this is the criteria who we will bring in, who we can demonstrate over their lifetime will create wealth, not subtract from wealth. So I think that is probably a good place, trying to be as politically neutral as I can without getting into the debate about all the poor people in the world and how, what a terrible life they have. That is a fact, and it's not going to get any better with climate change. We still keep seeing international turmoil. There's always going to be lots and lots of pressure for lots and lots of people to move. The question for any UK government is, what is our threshold? What is our public? And I just detect public tolerance is now creeping away a bit here, and that people do want more effective controls than we've had recently.
At Ledden, we've built the best Bitcoin-backed loan platform in the world. Proven, trusted, growing. Ledden's proven track record speaks for itself. Visit ledden.io/Mr. Obnoxious to get started. Ledden, there is no second best. Ledden is not regulated in the United Kingdom. Any credit products or virtual asset services provided by Ledden are not subject to UK regulatory protections. Please consider the risks associated with virtual assets and consult a financial advisor before making any decisions.
I think it's not even just creeping in. I think like I say, it's become a main policy item of Reform Party because they know people are unhappy with this, but it also feels like something that needs to be dealt with alongside reforms to the welfare state, because that itself is ballooning. And if that's already under pressure and we're throwing more people into the mix who are maybe not net contributors, they're maybe net takers, that is then compounding these problems.
Yeah, and it's linked with everything, so the social care policy, we are an ageing population. We need people to look after our older folk. And we don't pay care workers very well. And a lot of care homes are quite expensive. So that is a completely different sector to the one I worked in.
Yeah.
But you need some clever minds there to figure out, well, how do we get people to work longer, who are already here? How do we upskill people? How do we make that working in that sector more attractive? These are, basic questions for government. That a quick fix is, well, let's just bring in another 200,000, 300,000 from overseas to go and flood the care. That's a very quick fix. And actually you pay the price from that, because those people will get old as well and they will want to bring family over as well. And they're not necessarily going to be an economic benefit. So all of those arguments by much cleverer people than me need to be had. And I think that debate needs to be had in public about, what are you going to do about your welfare state? What are you going to do about your ageing population? What are you going to do? And immigration and bringing large people into the country is not a quick fix, actually. It could be even more harmful. So I'd like to see a lot more consideration given to those policies and plans. And then you can, start thinking about, well, how does immigration support what you're trying to do?
Tony, is there anything I've not asked you about that you wish I had? I'm just conscious, is there anything we've not covered we should have with regards to this topic?
I think perhaps terrorism.
Yes.
And stopping.
How big a problem is that still?
So, I first got involved with international terrorism during 9/11, as I said.
Yeah.
Because now that was, so we need to remember 9/11, because that was the worst terrorist attack in history. And, I urge your listeners, if they're interested in this subject, haven't read the 9/11 report, to read it. It's online, but it is catastrophic in that there were probably 16 or 17 opportunities for the US authorities to intervene to stop those people, or a great number of them, but they didn't. And that was largely because departments were working in isolation of one another. The FBI, the CIA, in INS as it was then, were not talking to one another. So there was a huge amount of work done in the States and Canada to ensure that we shared data and risk assessments and worked much more closely internationally. I'm a big fan of Interpol. I'm a big fan of Europol. This is international. So UN have got some good programs going. But what hit me really hard was the homegrown terrorism of 7/7, because I was direct reports of entry on 7/7, and we automatically assumed this would have been people like had flown in from, I don't know, Afghanistan or somewhere, and blown up our tubes. And it wasn't until a couple of days later that we realised that these were all British citizens. In fact, 3 of them were born here, and the other one was brought over as a baby from Jamaica. They were being radicalised within our own communities, right under our noses, and we didn't know. And and they'd been flying to places, Al-Qaeda training camps, to learn how to make bombs. And we didn't even notice.
Yeah.
And that would really sent a shudder up my spine, because if you have people already in your country, there's so much you can do with the border, because you can stop people at the border, actually, whether you're British or not. If we don't like the look of you, we'll stop you. Even if you get the police if you're a terrorist or criminal. So border is helpful for that travel bit of it. But in-country radicalisation, I think, is a very, very serious problem. And so we are, I take it from me, but listen to the current head of security services, there are significant threats in our communities right now from people who are being radicalized online by dangerous people. There is significant unrest in the Middle East, which could lead to the rebirth of ISIL with the latest. So I think we need to be very, very careful about national security. I'm really worried that there are people living in this country, or potentially even crossing our borders, going backwards and forwards. I studied the Paris attacks, of the Paris attackers. I think we found that about 8 or 9 of them had actually been to the Islamic State and come back into France again.
God.
A couple of them came in on a small boat, and we know that because we found their finger and fingerprinted it and caught them as coming. So there is a link between border security and national security, and we mustn't lose sight of that, because what we've got to try and do is disrupt terrorist travel, prevent terrorism, but more importantly, our people need to step up. This is your neighbour. This is the person living down the road. And, if you can see something funny or going on, all of the enforcement agencies need to rally behind that, because I'm really, really worried that, I'm not pointing the finger at irregular migrants. That's quite an easy political thing. Oh, look, he might be, yeah, of course they might be, but I think there are people already here. We need to learn the lessons of 7/7, that, we have to work with the communities and the community groups to make sure that any radical behaviour, be that on the left or the right or anyone else, where there are people in our midst that are going to cause harm. That's why intelligence is really, really important. And that's really something that I got very heavily involved with the London 2012 border security. We can flex the border. Some people probably who want to come to the Olympics didn't get to the Olympics, I'm afraid. And that's probably my fault. But, we were operating at a threat level that was a terrorist attack was highly likely. I wasn't prepared to take any risks. And, so we very, very thorough screening on anybody, before we gave them a pass to get into the country or into the game. So I'm worried about that. And I think it's something that has to form part of the debate. We talk about immigration and numbers and economics and what the rest of it, but security is a real big deal, and crime does pay. And there are some links, I think, between international organised crime, money and terrorist groups. And so, hats off to those guys still there in the agencies. They're not allowed to come and talk to you, but there are people, believe me, who are working very, very hard to behind the scenes in the police and the security services and the border force to keep us all safe. And I think that's a really important point for your listeners to bear in mind.
Well, it's an incredibly complex issue, and I think I've tapped into a little bit more of how complex it is by talking to you today. So I appreciate you coming in and explaining this all to me. I guess for me, it's going to be, I think the good question I would be asking somebody who maybe if they were in reform and they had this anti-immigration policy, is actually to say to them, okay, how are you going to do it?
Yeah.
How are you going to do this?
Yep.
What are you going to do about controlled immigration, legal immigration, illegal immigration? How are you going to deal with deportations? How are you going to deal with the ECHR? There's a lot of questions I think you could put to people to test whether they really understand the complexity of the issue.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, having been on the inside and spoken to people that are still in the inside, we have simply built legislation on top of legislation on the 71 Act. The legislation is a complete nightmare to navigate. The policy that flows from that is cut and pasted from lots of different documents. Young caseworker joining the Home Office on 20-25 grand a year has got to wade their way through all of this lot and make some sense of it. It's a complete, jumble of regulation.
We're a
law.
mess.
Someone needs to simplify all of that.
Is it a job for you?
Well, we did say we could. I've got some people working with me that we could help with it, but it needs investment, I think, because it's just become such a jumble. And the more you just throw bits on top of a haystack that's already collapsing, the more it's going to collapse, right? So, I do think that if we ever get the political space for someone to go into the Home Office, so wait a minute, let's forget about the policy. How do we simplify all these rules? And we're going back to the 70s, and these these conventions of the 50s that we've just built more and more on top of, with lots of judgments, and actually use technology. You know, there's lots of system people out there creating new tools now where actually it's much simpler to be able to say, well, actually you can put this stuff on a system, and the system can ask you a lot of questions. You don't even need to do it, and it will come up more with an answer. And I really hope that they do invest in that, and that, you know, and that just to give some of the civil servants a bit of breathing space, they are given sort of tools like that and opportunities to make it easy, because you say it is hugely complex. And it's just as complex for you, it's even complex for those people working on it.
Yeah,
you can imagine how they feel every day.
Yeah, well, listen, Tony, I appreciate you coming in to explain this all to me, and it is fascinating, and I think it's going to help me with further interviews I do with people who talk about this, because at least I can put to them the complexity of it and see what they say. But look, thanks for coming in, man. It's been great to meet you.
You're very welcome.
And thank you to everyone listening.